And the problem with those frameworks relative to identities, whether they're humans or machines and so on, is the temporal nature of it. Because even if you have a certification or accreditation, or you have a third party that asserts the validity of something, that can be compromised or in some way hijacked. So you still have to have additional layers on top of that, for the real-time nature of these types of problems.
And I would only disagree with one point. There is a standard for love. It's called Valentine's Day. There's marriage too, but we're violating one standard already today. So talk to my wife and she'll say the same thing. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, another question.
Hello, this is Jesus Marina from Fujitsu. I have a question. I have heard, this is really, a very quick question. I have heard like you guys saying about continuous compliance in the cloud. Can you give a brief, referral of how your companies can deal with continuous compliance, for example, for standards such as PCI?
Get security right first, then worry about compliance. That's my view.
I think there's something to be said for that. As vendors, we tend to focus on, do we meet a certain compliance standard? But when you talk to enterprise customers particularly, what an enterprise customer will tell you is, I care more that it's secure than that it's compliant, but I care an awful lot that it's compliant because I like my job. But at the end of the day, you can be fired because something wasn't compliant, or you can be fired because you got hacked. One is worse than the other, and people will always focus on security first and make sure that that checkbox for compliance is there. And well-seasoned CSO knows that just because something is compliant, it doesn't mean it's secure. So for us, and I think most of us on the stage will say the same thing here, that security comes first, and compliance with necessary standards is very important as a product feature, but that's not the goal of most security products unless they're compliance specific.
I mean, compliance in the cloud should be an automated process, right? And it should be a continuous process. Yep. Right. If you're thinking about cloud, you should think about, how do I make this process one that has 24/7 continuous and automated reporting to me, versus some arduous task that's either meaningless or temporal in nature, where once every 6 months somebody looks at something. I mean, it's completely worthless. Well, not completely. It's worth about this, maybe this, But the reality is that things change so frequently that the value of that beyond the rubber stamp, it's better for your auditors to have continuous controls monitoring, and there are ways emerging to do that. So.
Yeah, and Chris Hoff talked about that in his presentation, right? Automation and then cloud audit. So one of the things that you can participate in, if you've got opinions on automation and compliance, you can join the cloud audit working group, and get some new, fresh ideas perhaps in that area. But that's a lot what Chris was talking about, right?
So I mean, the regulations don't change just because we've moved to the cloud. I mean, the regulations are still there. You just have to come up with different controls and different processes to meet those regulations. Unfortunately, with the cloud, in certain instances, we're not there yet. And actually, people are finding out that they are actually a little bit sort of, vulnerable. They don't have some of that automation that they need. Right. An example, I think, as we look forward into the future, will change. We got a great look at, say, for example, the way Salesforce.com's application works this morning. And there was a lot of discussion about all the roles and profiles and things like that, about what users can do in that application. But given the mantra that CISOs have around access appropriate to role, they need to understand instantly what all their users are able to do within that application. Given that the way you administer all of this today is through a UI in that application, it's virtually impossible to pull that information out, to analyze it, and to comprehend it. What that drives to is the need for APIs, as people were talking about this morning. I think it was Chris Hoff, that make it very important that those APIs are enabled for people to get access to that information, whether it's authorization information, audit information, whatever it is.
I was waiting for APIs to come up, right? And this is what's really key. I think compliance and security automation obviously go hand in hand. And it's going to get really challenging, when you look at how do you measure compliance across a stack of solution providers, right, or service providers, if you will. So, the application that's being, delivered to the market tomorrow is going to be one where, the storage component is delivered from a vendor. The security component is going to be delivered as a service from another vendor. And the mashup is a very real one, where web services frameworks are going to be used in order to become the glue, right? And so how do you, without automation, how do you manage and measure compliance across the complete stack, across different cloud providers and ecosystems? And that's the real challenge that we have over the next few years.
Is there another question? Oh, Becky, go ahead.
This side's winning. Come on, that side. Come on.
Hi, Becky Swain, one of the founders of the Controls Matrix. I wanted to up-level the conversation about risk management. So when we form the Controls Matrix, it's a series of rules essentially mapped to regulations or standards. These rules were created for a purpose. So I want to ask you guys, as those who implement these rules in some way, shape, or form, how do you think and have these conversations with your customers on risk management and, just the risk, likelihood of harm or loss? Is this something you do with your customers, or do you think about security in that viewpoint?
I don't. I've given up on it for now. Maybe I'll go back in another life or something. You've used the word likelihood, and I think that that's an issue. I think that there are certain kinds of security platforms and security controls where the word likelihood comes into play. For example, the likelihood that an end user is going to call for a password reset, easy peasy, and could tell you how much I'll save if I implement this control and this technology. And there are metrics related to garden variety viruses and stuff like that. But when you get into the realm of, let's say, emerging technologies, whether it's cloud or mobility or pick a technology area, and then you get into also the threat actors, whether they're insiders or nation state or cyber criminals, and the vectors that they take, that area becomes so difficult to deal with on a risk management basis. I think it really comes down to more one of understanding what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to reduce certain factors? For example, are you trying to reduce mean time to discovery of zero-day malware? Are you trying to reduce the number of data leakage events that have occurred? Because the likelihood and the magnitude may be something that you may or may not have studied in your organization. And even if you did, how does that relate to your peers is a very, very difficult metric to understand these days. So, I'm focused on sort of identifying metrics that are security operational in nature and trying to squish those where they have direct impact on some event that either has a real-time component or has a component that has some immediate benefit to something that's happening now within the organization. And arguably within a cloud environment, that has some validity today.
Yeah, I think that all of us have tools on the analytics side which help with it. But when you ask a customer, how do you measure risk? That's a difficult thing. I think the cloud, actually, I think the cloud is going to help with that, believe it or not. I think what Eddie said is right on. I think you'll have some opportunities in the future where you can not only identify with automation cloud risks, but also know how am I performing compared to my peers, right? So I think that that's going to be, with the correlation models and the centralization opportunities that the cloud provides, I think that's going to help introduce some new ways to measure risk.
I think we're drinking some security vendor Kool-Aid, actually, when we're going to automate our risks. Once you do that, they just become sort of operational things. But the real risks are black swan events, things that you didn't automate, and that's why they're such big risks, and that's why they can cause such damage. And that's where, rather than focusing on likelihoods and statistics, focusing on best security practices is going to be far more impactful. However, for keeping your job, it's nice to have a spreadsheet that shows your risks were nicely quantified, but it's more important that it actually works than that the models said it would work. So I think a lot of us are going to be feeling soothed by the fact that we have, quote, automated our risks. But in reality, what we're doing is we're automating security best practices, which reduces risks. But if we can get the budget for that by saying that we've automated our risks, let's do it.
Yeah, from our customers, when I hear, risk from a business standpoint played back, we hear the words liability. Who is basically taking on the liability associated, for example, of cloud computing, SaaS computing, things like that. You pull that back into the identity world, and the notion of a SaaS provider outsourcing the authentication of the user back to their customers basically could imply a liability shift, especially as we see this technology used in the financial services world and the healthcare world. Suddenly there's some real risks you might face as the provider if you are pushing, allowing your customers to authenticate your users on your behalf. A few years ago, there was a lot of discussion about having federation legal agreements and all sorts of things that have to be countersigned with bunches of lawyers to make sure that this was all going to be okay effectively. Moving forward, what we found is that a lot of this stuff tends to ride now on the existing business contracts that organizations have in place to leverage each other's services, and that the lawyers figure that the SLAs in place for that sort of thing meets their expectations well enough.
Wow.
When we talk about SLAs and risk, one thing that doesn't come up too often now is insurance. Going back 11 or so years, a company I worked with that's been sold several times is now part of Savvis, was the first company that had a deal with an insurance company where you could say, security audit performed by Exodus, policy available for business loss through a hacking attempt available from insurance company. It was one of the big ones who's probably gone bankrupt by now as well. But the bottom line is when we're talking about risk and we're talking about SLAs and we're talking about likelihoods, at some point, pooling of risk across cloud providers or pooling of risk so that it can be insured and insurable is going to become very important. And I think that some of the things the CSA is doing now will lead to quantifiable enough risk that you can begin buying a policy that says, I've done my best as an enterprise, I'm well protected, I've followed all the best practices, but if something unpredictable happens, I can share the risk with my responsibility in the share the responsibility and risk with my provider in the form of a policy, an insurance policy rather than a security policy. I think that that's going to become really important probably in about 4 years.